Thank you very much. Thank you for coming and welcome. This lecture on behalf of the Lake City Historical Society, as you know, is designed to help fund some of the important things that the Historical Society has been supporting. As you know, my name is Denny Robertson. You've heard that already. I grew up in South St. Paul, which is a small town just downriver from the Twin Cities. And our home was on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. And as a child during World War II, I grew up there observing the activities on the Mississippi River with steamboats and other river traffic, and I developed my kinship with the Mississippi River. And my wife and I are fortunate enough now to have, during the past almost 2 decades, lived on the shore of the Mississippi River on the south side of Lake City. So that explains my relationship with the Mississippi. Now, 50 years ago, I started a residency at the Mayo Clinic. And I have been associated with the Mayo Clinic in some capacity since that time, and I continue to be associated with the Mayo Clinic today. So that serves to identify my relationship to the Mayo Clinic. I'm going to relate to you the Mayo Clinic's relationship to the Mississippi River next. The Mayo Clinic has been heavily involved in the river and river activities. I'm also going to review a little bit about the history of the Mississippi River, the history of the banjo, and history of steamboats. And some of this discussion will be associated with sounds of the river. We'll have images and a variety of different sources. I'm not going to emphasize my resources that I've used for this, but I have them in the next 5 slides. I'll go by them quickly. I just want to tell you about Lowell Schreier for a moment. Lowell wrote a history of the banjo. There are other people involved in my resources, and I want to mention that the image that I'm using of one of the steamboats is from Billy Hunt, and you'll recognize it as a steamboat, a Mississippi Queen coming up in the fog. There are other people to identify as a resource, including the Lake City Historical Society, my colleague Helmut Buettner, who gave me some sounds of the Calliope on the Mississippi Queen, and Larry Nielsen, who supplied an image of, you'll see it as we continue. Now, Mayo's first encounter with the Mississippi River occurred in 1854. This was the year of the Grand Excursion. Now, the Grand Excursion was a flotilla of 5 steamboats that came up the Mississippi River to showcase St. Paul. There were investors, people from the railroad. There were even, President Fillmore was a past president, politicians of other sorts. So this was a big event, and it was called one of the grandest events ever. The New York Times said that people who developed cholera didn't develop cholera from epidemic. It was because of an overindulgence of the fine things afforded by the steamboats on the upper part of the Mississippi River. 1854 was a noteworthy year also because it was the year of the Gadsden Purchase. That gave the United States the complete integrity of the lower 48 states. 1854 also was the year that Hiawatha was written by Longfellow. Now, the Mississippi River, as you know, starts as a creek up at Lake Itasca, flows some 2,400 miles down to the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans, flows past 10 states. It is a wonderful, wonderful river. But when William Worrell Mayo came here in 1854, he was seeking to improve his health. He suffered from recurrent fever, and he said, I'm leaving, and until I get to a place where I can feel healthy, I'm going to continue moving west. He arrived at St. Paul, moved into the Minnesota area, and later on, he invited the rest of his family to come and join him. He founded then the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. This is just 35 miles from here, from the Mississippi River. This was the first multi-specialty group practice in the world. It became very successful, and it's probably the premier medical institution in the country or the world. There are now staff physicians and scientists that number in the 4,000s. Allied health staff, as you know, is huge. There's about 50,000 allied health people who are employed by the Mayo Clinic in one capacity or another. I'm not going to mention the other satellites and the broad expanse the Mayo Clinic has in the Mayo Health System, but you all know it here. We know about the buildings that have been thriving in Rochester, and they're continuing to be built. I can't imagine that William Worrell Mayo would be able to recognize Rochester today and believe what was going to happen when he came here as a family doctor. Well, in the 1900s, their practice was quite successful. And they decided, because they loved the Mississippi River, that they would design and have built for them 2 different steamboats in succession. The first one that they built was the Orinoco, and it's a handsome steamboat, as you can see. The steamboats were built with steam whistles, and generally they were chromatic whistles and 3 whistles in an open G chord. So there's some music that they first identified with the river. This Orinoco lasted about almost a decade and was replaced by the Minnesota. And as you can see, the success of the Mayos was displayed by their Cadillac, which was inside the steamboat. Now, they subsequently had a diesel boat called the North Star, and they decided after a while that these boats should be sold, and the money from them would be a core fund that would be used for the social services and the humanities that the Mayo Clinic continued to sponsor. The Mayo brothers would go on these steamboats, and they would go to relax, and they would read. They would just simply observe the changing landscapes of the river as they cruised down. It was a common thing for the families to go on different weekends. They would entertain guests, they would entertain their colleagues, entertain dignitaries, and each year they would go down the river, down to Hannibal. That was a regular excursion. They had presidents that joined them on the river boat, and here is a picture of William Mayo, one of the sons. You know, there were 2 sons after William Worrell Mayo. I had William and Charlie. I look at this image and I don't think this would be a fun boat ride. Nobody looks like they're having fun on there. But you look in the back of the boat and the Franciscan nuns. They were having a good time. So the river became an extension of the lives of the Mayo family and of the clinic, Mayo Clinic itself. Now, Mayo has also long recognized the role of music in medicine, and the famous band, the Turkey River All-Stars, has been featured annually in Mayo Clinic in a program called Harmony for Mayo. And the Mayo Clinic has actually hired the Turkey River All-Stars for a whole variety of events through the last 45 and 50 years. So there's a longevity in the relationship of Mayo to music and Mayo to the Turkey River All-Stars, and there's a longevity in the Turkey River All-Stars band itself. We've been going for a while. Let's talk a little bit about the Mississippi River. The river, as you all know, was recognized by the North Americans for many years before it was eventually seen by European explorers. The French heard about this great river, and it was described to them by the North American Indians, and they were in search of a couple of things. They wanted to find the areas of the great beef buffalo, and they also wanted to find a passage to the ocean that was supposed to be beyond in the west. Early explorers were looking for that passage, and Jean Nicolet in 1634 was so convinced he would see China when he reached the Great River. He dressed up in Chinese clothes so that his attire wouldn't be out of place. Now, he wore a tunic that was of a damask fiber, of damask fabric, and that comes from Damascus. And we kind of have heard Damascus in the news recently, but you can imagine this man with these colorful images of birds and flowers on his jacket as he came looking for the Chinese when he got off. And he did find Lake Michigan, and when he reached the shore, he found Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the Winnebago Indians. Well, the French were responsible for some of the early explorations of the river, and I'm sure every school kid from Bluffview Elementary or Lincoln School can recite all the different explorers that were in the upper part of the river, but some notable explorers like Radisson and Groseilliers explored the area around Lake Superior, and they probably got down into the middle of Wisconsin, up where Hayward, Cable are, and maybe reached as far as Prairie Island, but that's uncertain. There were others that explored farther south. Marquette and Joliet came down the Wisconsin River, and they paddled from the Mississippi down to the Arkansas River, which is down here. And maybe they got as far as the Gulf of Mexico, but we don't really know that. So the distribution of the explorers up north down to this area is McGregor, and we go to St. Louis, and then down to all the way down to New Orleans, was evaluated by these explorers, and each explorer claimed the land for France. Vive la France. Now, this piece of information is very uncertain and maybe a myth, but it's the best I could learn about why Lake Pepin is Lake Pepin. But there were two brothers who were the sons of a person named Jean Pepin, who was given a land grant by Louis XIII in Canada. And these two brothers were explorers and apparently came down to the region of Lake Pepin in 1679, and from there the name Lake Pepin was derived. Now, the first recorded map identification of Lake Pepin was in 1682. But before that, Father Hennepin, and I think all the school kids know about Father Hennepin, he paddled up the river to Lake Pepin, stopped at Point au Sable before continuing up to Red Wing, where he met and was captured by the Metawakan Sioux Indians. His release from the captivity was effected by Monsieur Duluth, who worked with some of the Indians in the Mille Lacs area to help the release of Father Hennepin. Very colorful days. Now, the early fabric of the river and the culture was largely dependent on the fur trade. And the voyagers made this fur trade into a very robust economy. They could trade everywhere in the world. Beaver skins were demanded by the Europeans. So this was a very active culture, and they traded their furs up and down the river, and we know some of the historical towns along the river. And they also traded, of course, up the St. Lawrence. In 1803, a big event occurred when Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase from France, and this opened up the Mississippi River Valley to lots of other folks, to American settlers. Remember, the settlers would come up on foot by keelboat. Eventually, they came up by steamboat. The early economy of the river depended on not only the beaver skins, but lead, timber, cotton, and sugar. Now remember when William Worrell Mayo came up in 1854, they went up to see St. Paul. St. Paul had no telegraph at that time. In 1858, Minnesota was made a state, but they didn't learn about it for 2 weeks after the decision was made in Washington because there was no telegraph. The telegraph was sent to Prairie du Chien, and then by steamboat, the message was brought up to St. Paul 2 weeks later to announce that, hey, Minnesota is a state. Well, by the middle of the 19th century, the Mississippi River was also called the Father of Waters, or the Great River, and it evoked this romantic notion that we all have about river gods and nature deities of the past. And the era was made especially famous by the writings of Mark Twain. I like some of the things Mark Twain said about the Mississippi River. He said, it's a majestic, magnificent river flowing its mile-wide waters under the shining sun. But the other thing I like better is that it's not a commonplace river, but on the contrary, is in every way remarkable. And this is his statement as he made it. It's in all ways remarkable. Well, the watershed of the Mississippi River, as you know, encompasses about half of the continental United States. And the river, as it flows, has been followed by a natural migration pattern with the migratory waterfowl. And it is the largest and most heavily traveled of all of the waterways and migratory pathways in North America. There are some 211 species of fish, all kinds of birds, of course, and we're seeing a resurgence of some of the critters that we like to see now with the eagles. I want to take you on a little quick tour down the Mississippi River, starting up in the region of the north part where wild rice grows, and here we see harvesting the wild rice on the upper Mississippi River, and the morning fog over the upper Mississippi, winding its way through Minnesota. And remember that the upper part of the river for 600 miles of the 2,400 is in Minnesota. And when we think about the length of the Mississippi River, remember too, I lived in Cass Lake, Minnesota on an Indian reservation for a year in 1962. And I was told by the nurses at the hospital that I was at that during World War II, German prisoners of war were in a camp up by Cass Lake. Well, these are 18-year-old kids, but they knew something about the geography of the Mississippi River. And they knew somehow it flowed into another country, like Mexico. They heard of the Gulf of Mexico. So they broke out of camp one night up in northern Minnesota, not realizing when they stole these canoes that the river flowed north first, then it flowed east, and then it flowed south. So after about 3 days of being eaten alive by mosquitoes and cut up by brambles, they gave themselves up. But if they had been in Europe going 100 miles, they would have been in maybe 1 or 2 different countries. Not so with the great Mississippi River. So Minneapolis and St. Paul have lots of bridges, and then we come to Lake Pepin, as we know, which is a natural lake formed by the damming up of the sand by the Chippewa River. And the lake is, of course, really a river, but it's used as a lake, and it has the largest private marina in the whole Mississippi River with all the sailboats. There are other things that are on that Mississippi River out here, Lake Pepin, and I understand that that this little pontoon boat escaped these 2 towboats which seem to want to engulf this. Now I'm going to show you this same pontoon boat in a later year being chased by some other boats, but it got away from the towboats. But, and I understand also Columbus apparently came up this far. This is the Nina, a replica of the caravel that Columbus had, and Constance Anderson, who was here, sailed on the Nina and went for a whole summer exploring wherever they went. A big adventure. This is also the Nina and the Pinta. See this little boat out here? This man has a fondness for trying to outrun some of the boats. He did get away. Now, there's another thing that can occur in this river. This is the monster called Pepe. Now, many of you know that Pepe was first seen in 1871, and it's reported, it's in the newspaper. It was in the Wabasha Sentinel, so it's got to be true. A couple of people recognized that this monster came out on the river. It was about 30 feet long, and it was about, thought it was the size of an elephant or a rhinoceros. It was a big thing to be identifying, and sort of was lost for a while until Larry Nilsson thought there might be an interest in searching for Pepe again. And although there was a reward offered if they could catch Pepe alive, we identified in June 2011 this, and maybe you can see the teeth here. There's an eye, and there are eyelashes on here. And this monster that came ashore on a high wind and high waters seemed not very alive. Even when dogs came to mark their territory, it seemed indifferent to the dogs. But one day, this happened. And so we know that there was some grumblings going on inside this monster. And just as mysteriously as it arrived, one evening it disappeared into the dark waters of Lake Pepin, and it probably is still out there. So if you are out looking around, be careful, but we also know this is pretty much a friendly monster. As we go down further on the river, we get to Wabasha, and here's Chief Wabasha, whose statue is proudly displayed down on the corner of the main street, and we're watching the American Queen go by. As we go down further in the river in the fall, the beautiful colors of the Mississippi are evident, and eventually we do get down to New Orleans, where there's good jazz. The Dixieland Jazz Band is shown here in New Orleans. When I have given this talk elsewhere, people don't realize what winter is really like in some areas, like in Polynesia or some South America and some of these spots. But I show them what winter is really like here. And the river freezes, and the cars and trucks can drive on the river and cross over to save some mileage by going to Wisconsin. At least they used to be able to do that. And they still drive trucks up and down the river, as you can see. And it's really a shock. Some of the residents come out, they've been growing up in Georgia or Mississippi, and they've come out to our place, and they can't believe this in the wintertime. And even light airplanes land on the snow, and it's another miracle in the making. But the river does shift. It's like tectonic plates. As the movement occurs, these plates of ice begin to fracture, they build up, and it has been well described by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Now, Laura Ingalls Wilder, as you know, grew up near Pepin, just east of Pepin, Wisconsin. And she was born a couple of years after the Civil War, but didn't publish her first book, Little House on the Prairie, until 1935. But she describes going across the river. And you can imagine going across the river with Ma, Pa, and Mary, and Laura. And they were listening to the clopping of the dull hooves on the ice. And you could hear the rims of the wagon wheels crunching on the ice. And all around outside the wagon was dark, empty stillness. You can imagine that. They made it across the river. When they got to the Minnesota side that night, they could hear the river breaking up with the cracking of ice. And those of you who live around in this area have heard those cracks. They're long reports, and she described them as like rifle shots, but louder and longer. Wonderful descriptions. We know also that the river cannot be tamed. Despite thousands of commissions that have been assigned to try to control the river continues to flood. This was called the Brown God by one of our famed authors, and you can see why it would be called the Brown God. Let's talk a little bit about the steamboats. We know that the whole development of the upper Mississippi River Valley and the tributaries of the Mississippi went hand in hand with the development of the steamboat. The first steamboat that came onto the Mississippi River was in 1811. A long time ago. It went from Pittsburgh through the Ohio River to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans, and it was called the New Orleans. This is a replica that was made, and it's a photograph. The first steamboat to reach the Minnesota Territory was in 1823. Now remember, Fort Snelling was dedicated, and the fort was made in 1819, 1920. So the first steamboat to reach that was the Virginia, and this is a depiction of the fort, and we can see some of the Indians here. This is a painting by Seth Eastman. Maybe some of you have seen that. By the 30s, the traffic in the river was increasing, and cotton from the south was a big commercial success. And it drove the economy. Cotton was the king. Look what is happening on this next image. They're loading cotton. Is that OSHA approved? Do you think? This is pretty overloaded, but there's money in that cotton. This is a picture, and the next one, of unloading cotton. So cotton was very, very important to the economy of the South and to the North. Steamboats were used for just about everything, for commerce, transportation, inspiration, pleasure. They brought news, they brought music, entertainment. There were showboats that came. In 1831, one of the big showboats came up. Even circuses to the small frontier towns along the river. And you remember, if you drive down the river to McGregor, that's where the Ringling Brothers had their start, and they saw a showboat. And they saw some people doing some trapeze work and some animals. They said, we can do that. So the Ringling Brothers trained their goat to stand on its front hoofs and did some trapeze acts, and so they did pretty well. This shows a working steamboat moving logs on the upper river, because logging was a huge industry here. This is my great-grandfather Staples' steamboat working on the St. Croix River moving logs. This is a view of the Ohio River near Cincinnati, where people would come down to meet the river boats, even in the wintertime, collect mail. And here we see two steamboats passing up and down the river by Maiden Rock. This is the steamer Red Wing on Lake Pepin. Now, a docking steamboat came, not only brought livestock and cargo and goods, medicine, but it also brought gamblers and itinerant scoundrels. Now, you'll appreciate, I think, this next picture. You may have to look at it kind of carefully. Those in the back may not see it so well, but these folks are watching a crap game. So there's gambling going on the deck of the steamboat, but you could see this one fella has his hands in the back pocket of another fella. So there's the culprit right there. That's some steamboats were like floating palaces. And the steam whistles and the Calliopes, which came on, that was invented in 1855, they could be heard announcing their arrival even before you could see the steamboat coming. They became very plentiful and reached their glory days in the mid to late 1800s. Here's an image of people out on a Sunday afternoon enjoying a cruise on a steamboat. This is New Orleans in the mid-1800s, and you can see all the steamboats along the shore. And you can also see Canal Street. There's Washington Square with the cathedral there. So the steamboats were very important. This is an image Billy Hunt gave me. And you can see this steamboat coming up in the fog. You can kind of anticipate that this is probably going to play a whistle. And the haunting whistle of a steamboat, you can imagine in the olden days when this whistle was blown on a steamboat announcing its arrival. And one long, two shorts. What a great sound. I recorded that in Red Wing. That was from the Delta Queen. The steamboats had to stop often on the river. They burned through some 20 to 25 cords of wood a day. And a cord of wood is 4 by 4 by 8, so it's a big amount of wood for their fuel. And they were a danger to other people, especially if they traveled at night. Reminds us of that little fellow on the pontoon boat, but this is a raft, and of course endangered by the steamboat. The steamboats raced. They raced in the daytime, and when they weren't racing, the captains often competed with each other for the best food or the best music on board. They raced at nighttime, and they raced until fire came out of their stacks, and they raced until they burned sometimes. The average life expectancy of a steamboat was about 5 years. So the boilers would blow up, and they weren't tended well. So disasters occurred. You maybe do not know, maybe you don't know about the Sultana. This is probably the largest peacetime maritime disaster, certainly in American history. The Sultana was loaded with soldiers after the Civil War that brought them up from Andersonville. They were on their way to Memphis. And there were 2,500 people on this boat. And the boiler, which was in ill repair, and the captain was made aware of it, the boiler exploded, and the boat caught on fire, and over 2,000 people drowned. More than on the Titanic. There were about 300 people more than drowned on the Titanic, which occurred 47 years later. This is a sketch of the Sultana burning. Now, the Sultana is not the only disaster that we know about. Here in Lake City, we know about another disaster that occurred. This is the Sea Wing. The Sea Wing is an actual photograph showing folks from Lake City and from Red Wing on the Sea Wing, and this is on Lake Pepin. 1 July, and you know how rapidly a storm can develop on this lake, and they didn't have the advantage of knowing radar. But anyway, the disaster occurred. The Sea Wing was overturned, and the next day you can see people looking for survivors in the wreckage of the Sea Wing. I photographed a newspaper article that I debated about showing, but I think it's worthwhile. It is from the graphic from Lake City, and the graphic is still in existence, as we know. It talks with the headlines of Lake Pepin's horror. 98 persons find a watery grave. I mean, this is a big thing that happened here. And this, I think, vividly portrays what we saw in the image. The graphic descriptions are worth reading. Now let's talk about something nicer, and we'll talk about the Calliope. This is the Julia Bell Swain. The Julia Bell Swain is no longer on the river, but it had a Calliope, and it played very nicely. The Calliope was patented by Joshua Stoddard in 1855 in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was a huge apparatus, and it was controlled by steam. You had 15 different pipes of different lengths to play delicate, mellifluous music. Well, there's no mellifluous music that comes out of a steam Calliope, and there's no Calliope that can be in tune, because the steam heats up the pipes, and the pipes change their pitch. So we don't see or hear good music generally out of the Calliope, but it's colorful, and at one time there were 800 steamboats that had Calliopes on board. So the Calliope initially was designed for churches but it didn't seem to fit well in some of the churches. But it was then purchased by some of the circuses. It led the parades that came into town. You could hear a Calliope against the wind for 4 miles. I mean, they're really loud. And this is what a steam Calliope. You see it's starting to warm up, and the pitch continues to change. So that's a Calliope for you. This is a Mississippi Queen, which had a wonderful Calliope on board. And my colleague, Helmut Buettner, happened to film this, and I just think this is great. That's the way they are, folks. And see, the pitch is changing all the time. Try to play a banjo with that. Well, let's talk about the banjo. This is a featured instrument on the steamboats, and you can hear the sounds of the banjo in the evening, early hours of the morning, and folks were singing and dancing along the shores when the steamboats arrived. Now, the banjo was one of the primary instruments, and he transmitted songs, the folk music that were just passed on from one person to another by ear. There was no written music early. It was the instrument through which the rhythm of black music came to the piano. Stephen, Scott Joplin's mom actually played the banjo. So Joplin learned some of the rhythms of the banjo from that he played on the piano and translated it. And the rhythms were, the banjo as they evolved, were ragged rhythms, and that's sort of where the ragtime concept comes from, is there was a syncopation in the rhythms of the banjo. This is probably the earliest image that is of a banjo, and this is the Abbey Rockefeller Center in Williamsburg, Virginia, and it's somewhere around the 1700s this was painted. Now, we don't know what the banjo sounded like, but the original banjos were a stick with a gourd and a skin stretched across it with horsehairs. And they maybe had 1 string, sometimes they developed 2 strings. I don't know what this sounded like, but I'm getting nervous, I gotta play. So I'm just gonna play about 15 seconds worth here, but I think that maybe it sounded something. I am nervous. So anyway, 1 string often was displayed, so we just don't know what was happening at that time. Well, you don't want to hear more of that. So as the banjo evolved, and it did evolve, it became a 4-stringed instrument and then a 5-stringed instrument. The Notes on Virginia, written by Thomas Jefferson, describes a little bit about what he called the banjar. And it was played by the slaves. And he observed the sounds and thought that it was kind of an interesting sound. By the 1820s, there were a lot of people who had learned about the banjo sounds on the plantations, and they did the typical thing with black cork, blacking up their faces, pretending they were plantation people. Some of the African Americans, and they went around in what was called minstrelry. They traveled through the country playing. Joel Sweeney was an important figure in the early development of the banjo, and his probably most important contribution was to take the banjo out of the plantation into the Victorian parlor to give it some public exposure. He was from Virginia, and he helped to develop the plantation melodies into this entertainment beyond the minstrel show initially, but then after the minstrel came vaudeville. But the minstrel shows had a blackface performer It was usually a white person corked up with black. And there was a violin, a tambourine, and bones. But the banjo anchored the minstrel line. Stephen Foster, you all know about, he died destitute, but he learned music from laborers, Negro laborers in a warehouse. He worked in Philadelphia. He sold Old Susanna for $100 in 1848. Lots of other songs, Camptown Races, My Old Kentucky Home. And I'll play you just a little tune of that. He composed about 100 songs. And he ended up selling his whole collection, I think, for something like $1,500. And if you were Stephen Foster's He composed songs for the New Christy Minstrels. The banjo was very popular. It was illustrated in books. Here's an illustration in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Musical groups played all over. The banjo, fiddles. The banjo was portable. Piano wasn't portable. The banjo was more durable than the guitar at that time. Now, Mark Twain said, when you want genuine music, just smash your piano and involve the glory-beaming banjo. Now, I don't know if this kid thinks it's so glory-beaming because he's got his ears plugged. And one of my grandson's granddaughter actually sent me a bumper sticker that says, "Run faster, I hear banjos." The banjo eventually became transformed and became fairly sophisticated. It could be used on the concert stage, and the promotions of this were from banjo prizes and from the manufacture by banjos by the Stewart Company. The Stewart Company probably did a whole lot for promoting the banjo. There were all men's banjo clubs in the colleges. Girls played the banjo, lovely ladies, and they were all women's banjo clubs as well. It played a prominent role, as we know, in the development of ragtime and jazz, and is considered an original American instrument, but we know it's not an American instrument. It came from Africa, and the blacks brought it when they came over as slaves. Now let's just finish up with a little bit about the steamboats, because they reached their great popularity when the Mayo practice was in its infancy. And we remember, we talked about the Grand Excursion in 1854 when several of the steamboats, about 5 of them, came up, showcasing the upper part of the river. One of the steamboats that I would have loved to have a photograph of or an image of is called the Banjo, and it brought minstrel shows up in 1850s up to all the way up to Stillwater in St. Paul, Minnesota. You could get on board for 25 cents. It's a pretty good deal. And there was a lot of shows. It was more kind of like a vaudeville show. Dixieland jazz also came up the river on showboats. And Louis Armstrong, he traveled on a steamboat called the Sydney. And in 1918, he brought his Dixieland band called the Fate Marable Jazz Band. And of course, it had a banjo on board. And I'm not going to play his music, but this is the Turkey River All-Stars in the background playing a little bit of jazz. I think you'll be able to hear it. And we'll just continue to go down the river looking at some of the other boats. This is the steamer Sydney in Red Wing, same one that Louis Armstrong was on. And we know that they continue to carry passengers, and people experience this kind of thrill and the nostalgia of being able to be on a riverboat, dancing, listening to the Dixieland music. They were finer than anything on shore, according to Mark Twain. They were like palaces. And this is an image of the Delta Queen, a photograph I took in 1982. And it was a good enough photograph that Minnesota Medicine published it on the front cover, in which I had an article in the journal. You'll also maybe not recognize the inside of the Delta Queen, but it became a historic landmark. Unfortunately, now the Delta Queen is a restaurant in Chattanooga. And this is the famous Turkey River All-Stars in 1982. And Mr. Fields is over in the corner there. He looks exactly like he did in this picture. That's Mr. Fields. I look exactly the same too. But my hair's changed. So we're still going strong. Now, in 2004 was the Grand Excursion reenactment. There were 15 paddle wheelers that came up the river. This is a big event, and you all remember who live around in this area. So there was a special commemorative stamp here. Lake City had this stamp, and this portrays it. And the Grand Excursion was really grand. Here we see some images that when the paddle wheelers arrived in St. Paul, they were announced with cannons. And you can see the fire coming out of this cannon. Those were real cannons they were shooting to announce their arrival. The Anson Northrop, mother and daughter Schreiers, shown here. And remember when the Delta Queen was moored here in Lake City? Beautiful sight. This is the Shotzi. My wife and I had our wedding reception on the Shotzi just the other day, 19 years ago. Whoa. And this is the Harriet Bishop and the Lily Bell. I haven't seen the Lily Bell lately. And the Celebration Bell, of course. Pretty lady. The Peoria, the Mississippi Queen. Paddle Wheel Lounge on the Mississippi Queen. Here's Fred Dodd playing the banjo, an extraordinary banjo player. The Jonathan Wilk, that burned down. It was in Winona. Remember, it was a landmark down there? Now, I put a blue slide in here because there were 2 years when there were no steamboats on the upper river. The Julia Bell Swain's off, the American Queen's off, Delta Queen's off. And eventually they brought back the American Queen last year and a new riverboat called the Queen of the Mississippi. This is the Queen of the Mississippi that I photographed in Red Wing last year. It's a beautiful boat on the outside. And here's the American Queen in La Crosse last year. Now look at the smokestacks. We're going to show the American Queen, and this is the picture of the American Queen as it goes by Reed's Landing. When the American Queen goes under a bridge, it's got to lower the stacks. They go forward. And after it passes, you see that one stack is up, and the other one will be up shortly. Don't forget, we have the Pearl of the Lake here in Lake Pepin, and if you haven't been out on it, get out on it and look for Pepe. It's a wonderful little excursion. We have it right here. This is the Mississippi Queen. It's going downriver. So I hope you've enjoyed this little composition and production here. So thank you for coming. We're going to be dismissed. We've gone a little bit over time, but appreciate your patience.